afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Australian-China Institute for Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. As always, before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we are all sitting on today at various locations. Today, I'm in the Institute, which is located at the Parramatta South Campus. So I would like to particularly acknowledge the Darug people of the Darug Nation and pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome and welcome back to our Chinese Australian History Seminar Series. And today's lecture is the last one of this series. And it covers 1972 to 2020, coinciding the establishment of the diplomatic relations between the People's Republic of China and Australia, right up to today, with a very interesting and loaded title, One Multicultural Nation. As before, we will take questions from the audience at the end of the lecture. So please post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will collect them for Michael to respond when he finishes the lecture. Now, please welcome Professor Michael Williams.
Thank you, Jen, and welcome everyone to this last lecture in this series. I'll just bring my screen up and we can begin. Oops. Oh, it's the wrong screen. Oh, something's gone wrong.
It looks so good.
Okay, good. All right, this is where I want to start. Sorry, Jen. Okay, welcome everybody. So today, as Jen said, we're talking about the period from 1972 to 2020, which brings us up to the present. And I just wanted to feature this particular cartoon because it's an interesting example of kind of the mirroring that I've been talking about in this series. That is to say, our history, our current concerns and current perceptions kind of can mirror back on the history going back into the past. And this is a cartoon that highlights the more recent arrival of or revamping of citizenship tests in Australia. Now, for those of you who watched our lecture last time, which was the period of the 1950s and 60s, I mentioned that, in fact, in the 1950s and 60s, the Immigration Department did, in fact, use beer and barbecue as a kind of criteria for judging people's worthiness of becoming Australian citizens. It was a kind of de facto or informal test, citizenship test. Now, I don't think this cartoonist actually knew about that history. So what the cartoonist has done, I think, is in fact picked up not so much the history, but the psychology. And this is what I want to point out as being part of the mirroring, this continuing psychology whereby even under the so-called ideology of multiculturalism, there's still this effort to kind of make people conform to some mould. In the past, that was very much a white Australia mould. And even with these more modern citizenship tests, we're still looking at people and governments and trying to redefine Australia in some term, and one that perhaps mitigates against multiculturalism. So I just want to point out that this is kind of the mirroring that I'm talking about. And this cartoonist has picked up on some of that quite well. So this mirroring of Chinese-Australian history, I think the first glimmerings of which I pointed out were occurring during the anti-Japanese war period of the 1930s and 40s. And of course, in this period is driven even further by changes, particularly changes coming from the People's Republic of China and Australia's changing relationship with the People's Republic. The mirroring, as I pointed out before, takes place on a number of dynamics. Class, for example, the changes from working class to middle class in terms of the Chinese-Australian history. Language, much greater diversity of languages away from just those of Canton and southern China. Gender, much more gender balance than in the previous history before 1949. Change in identity, how people identify as Chinese, Chinese-Australian and so forth, very much has evolved, particularly in this period. And finally, of course, the context of multiculturalism. Now, this 50-year period brings us up to the present day. And this, of course, is territory that historians don't normally cover. And so I'm not intending to give a thorough history of this period. I will give a bit of a potted history just to remind us of some of the events that are happening. But the main emphasis of this seminar, this lecture today, will be focusing on the forces that are impacting on how we perceive Chinese-Australian history, in the recent present, but also going back over 200 years or more throughout the whole period of this series. So to that end, I divide this lecture into roughly 4 sections. The first period will cover the very crucial period of 1972 to 1989, period of recognition of China, evolution of multiculturalism, and the beginnings of the reform of China, particularly economic reforms, but not, as we'll see, particularly political reforms. Then a larger period, I'm just losing my... Then a more significant period from 1989 to 2015, period of rapid growth, particularly in economics, immigration, trade, students, art, and politics. This transforming of what's seen as being Chinese in Chinese-Australian society and therefore in the history. And then I'll look very briefly at this last 5 years of the present, not again to remind us what's going on. You're more aware of what's going on than most, but to use this as a mirror of history to illustrate what's similar between the past and what is different. And then finally, most of the lecture will be talking about the perspectives of Chinese-Australian history and the factors that are influencing those perspectives. So this period, 1972 to 1989, a period which is highlighted by the leadership of Gough Whitlam and Mao in China and Australia respectively. And it's interesting to note that at the end of the decade, neither of these are leaders of their country, but they leave, of course, strong legacies behind. In Mao's case, the legacy of Communist Party rule itself, and also the beginnings of economic reform. If not initiated by Mao, his death at least allowing those reforms to commence in this period. Whitlam, a very short period, a relatively short period of Labor Party government, but nevertheless one that crucially laid the foundations for many changes in Australian society, and for our purposes, most importantly, laying the foundations for the beginning of a multiculturalism, which then continues to grow, particularly in succeeding 2 governments. So in this period, though a relatively short period, there are many multi-level interactions. So in politics, we have a fair amount of continuity. From Whitlam to Fraser to Hawke, and from Mao to Deng, we have growing good relationships between China and Australia on the political level, with both leaderships intent upon forging a new relationship and one that will be mutually beneficial. And most of this benefit, as we know, takes place on an economic level. And this is the early foundations are laid here. And it's worth remembering that someone like, say, Stephen Fitzgerald, who is well known for being the first Australian ambassador to China, was only, of course, ambassador for a relatively short period of time and spent most of his subsequent career acting as an investment advisor in China, helping Australian companies, helping Australian firms deal with China, helping China deal with relationships with Western firms and developing these changes. But we should also remember that politics and economics, although these are the big ticket items, it's family connections with China that were always there. They'd been existed right throughout this period. They never disappeared even during the Cold War period of the 50s and 60s when China wasn't formally recognized. And of course, after this, they were able to grow again and to be re-energized. And not just family visits, but also donations, such as these ones. This is a school built in southern China in the 1980s and still operating as a school in China today. And there are many examples of these kinds of donations by people from around the diaspora, and particularly from Australia. And not just donations for schools and such community things, but also investments. The early days of investment there was a highlighting of investment from people who had some kind of connection with China. And of course, it's not by accident that Deng Xiaoping made Shenzhen the first special economic zone, because he knew that area of China had special connections with people around the world, particularly in places like Australia or North America. But at the same time as all this renewed kind of connection between Australia and China is happening, there's also a renewal of the Chinese Australian community in Australia And this is happening on a wider scale than simply relations with China. In fact, it isn't at this period much direct immigration from China at all. In fact, but there are plenty of people of Chinese heritage beginning to come into Australia. And these are mainly coming through from Vietnam, for example. This is the period of the Vietnamese boat people. And many of these Vietnamese boat people are, in fact, Chinese or of Chinese heritage and identify as Chinese. But, of course, they're not the same identification, not the same background as people who had previously been in Australia or people from China or Hong Kong or Taiwan, who are also increasingly coming to Australia in this period. So you've got things like the Indo-Chinese Association, for example, as an example of a Chinese association which identifies itself quite differently from previous community groups in Australia. More socially, we've got, say, the rise of multiculturalism, and this takes on a government form. It's a part of social engineering on the part of governments. It's the Fraser government, for example, the successor of the Whitlam government, the succeeding government after the Whitlam government, that establishes things like SBS. And SBS has played quite a crucial role in nurturing multiculturalism. Beginning as community radio stations, the ability for communities to express themselves in their own languages was fundamental to giving people the confidence to kind of really make multiculturalism work. And of course, SBS TV had a profound impact on mainstream Australia as well. I'm sure many of us remember seeing dubbed and subtitled films for the first time when SBS suddenly arrived on our TVs. The other thing that begins in this period, but it's only the small beginnings, is the reforms in the education sector, which the Hawke governments began. And this began to open up the universities and open up Australia to a much larger numbers of students, particularly from China. In small beginnings, 1983, there were only some 38 China-born overseas Chinese students. Of course, many students from other areas such as Hong Kong, Malaysia, and Taiwan, as that always had been. But by 1990, this figure had grown quite rapidly to some 16,000. And of course, even that number is quite small compared to modern day standards. Now, all of these, or many of these factors, these interrelations that are happening in late 1970s and into the 1980s, is due to the increasing impact of China on Australia and the changes in this China-Australia relationship. Not exclusively, but nevertheless, it's a major impact. Then in 1989, we have the Tiananmen Square massacre. Now, this generated quite a deal of sympathy for the students that were in Australia, some 16,000. Bob Hawke, then Prime Minister, directly intervenes to grant them all extension visas that ultimately allow them to remain as residents and then become citizens. And not just those 16,000 or so that happened to be in Australia in 1989, but also large numbers of dependents and other students arrived, so that by 1993 or more, some 40,000 mainly well-educated, mainly non-Cantonese speaking young people have settled in Australia directly from China. And this has a major impact in changing the demographics of Chinese Australian community and therefore the subsequent history. And then we need to ask ourselves the question, so Tiananmen is kind of a major turning point, obviously a dramatic turning point, but we need to ask ourselves, then what did all that mean? Was it merely symbolic? The kind of song and dance about human rights that went on quickly died away, and mainly China's economic relations continued pretty much as before, or in fact only increased it before. But there were also long-term implications, and most of these took place on the level of these new citizens, these new arrivals, and the increased immigration coming from China. Now we move into the next period, a longer period from the 1990s to around 2015. 2015 is a very arbitrary date. I don't make any particular claims for that date. It's just a convenient date from which to kind of look at things a little bit more historically before we get into the more immediate period. Now, this period is a period of great growth and change on many levels. And I'm going to argue that there are much continuity from the past, and I'll point out some of those continuities. But of course, history doesn't continually just repeat itself uniformly. There are also many discontinuities that I'll point out. We mean to say kind of things that we could recognise but have simply changed in nature or changed dramatically enough to point out what the differences are. And finally, there are some quite new elements in the history in the community which need also to be pointed out, new that haven't taken place or can't be seen to have taken place in earlier periods. So continuity, such dimensions as politics, quite obviously. For much of the period, the succeeding prime ministers and succeeding governments had pretty much the same aim, which was to maintain very good relationships with China and good economic relationships, to deal with things on a political level, on a soft level, but also to greatly increase the economic connections. There were changes. Howard, for example, downplayed the political and increased the economic. Rudd tried to look at things politically a little bit more in terms of human rights and didn't get very far. There were some hiccups under Gillard and Abbott, but compared to the current situation, by and large, you can say there's a continuity of good relationships and a determination on both sides to maintain that. And that's the kind of broad context within which the history is taking place. Economically, dramatic change. That is to say, by the end of the period, China is Australia's largest trading partner. Now, although this is a dramatic change, I'd argue this is a continuity because this has always been the aim of the Australian colonies or the British Empire before that, to increase trade with China. From the beginnings of the Opium War and the demands to trade with China, it's always been the desire of Western countries, and Australia's within that field, to increase its trade with China and supposedly make tremendous profits. And this is when it finally begins to happen. But of course, then you've got to ask yourself the question, perhaps you need to be careful what you wish for. And that's just to preempt some of the more modern problems. But nevertheless, up to this point, people are quite happy with this fact that China is the major trading partner now of Australia. Families. Now, again, I pointed out the new arrivals. People came around about 1989, 1990s. They were young, and that means that by 2014, and this is a graduating class from a school in Sydney of 2014, their children are born, they're Australian-born children, and they're growing up in Australia. And this is a class of girls school, some of whom are the descendants of these Chinese migrants, some are not. Of course, you can't tell just by looking at them. And that's the point. They're all Australian-born. They've all different heritages. They're all going to have a tremendous impact upon Australia. This is 2014. Now they're all young. They're all women pursuing their various careers in various aspects, going off in different directions. And this is something that needs to be seen as a continuity. There have always been Australian-born Chinese people. They've always had a big impact. But the numbers now are much increasing, and therefore the overall influence in the generations are also ratcheting up. The community. You know, it's good to be aware that we keep using this term Chinese, and we sometimes use the word Chinese simply means a language, sometimes to mean Mandarin, sometimes to mean Cantonese. But people should be aware that Chinese speakers from China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Malaysia, various parts of Southeast Asia, often speak a great variety of dialects. Even if they speak Mandarin as the official language of China, people very often speak another language or another dialect as part of their family or their provincial background. And this is important because this is how people identify with each other, how they group, sometimes how they migrate. And this has always been very important. It was important in the past with people from the various Cantonese languages, Taishan, various Cantonese dialects. And now it's even more important. There's an even greater variety of dialects. And this is worth keeping in mind because it influences how the history develops. And it's not as simple as simply identifying everybody as Chinese, and certainly not as simple as identifying people as Chinese as of the nation China. And finally, we're looking at the social aspect. And by social aspect, I mean the attitudes and ignorance of the wider Australian community. It remains true, even right throughout this period, that most Australians have a fairly profound ignorance of things Chinese, as a country, as a politics, as an economy, as a culture, and as a history. And there's many reasons for that. So I'm only going to talk about one aspect of that relationship, just to emphasise what it means, and that's the sheer differences in scale. So we're used to looking at maps like this where Australia and China seem roughly the same size. Australia's a little bit smaller. And of course, we're aware that Australia's population is very much smaller than China's population. But I think people don't quite understand just how great the differences are in scale. Here is a map where I've scaled Australia down to its size roughly proportional to the population of China. And you can see from this that Australia barely makes a middling province of China, and China has, of course, many provinces. And the point of this is that many of the impacts of China on Australia, in terms of on many levels, is simply due to this sheer scale. It has nothing to do with politics or government ideology, culture even. It's simply size, huge differences of size, and this is reflected in a great many things. But very often, people who don't quite understand this difference will look for other things to blame or other solutions, when in fact this is quite a simple solution to begin, simple explanation to begin with. So discontinuities. In 1996, 1997, we suddenly had the rise of One Nation and Pauline Hanson, including a very weak response from the then Prime Minister, John Howard. Now, this seemed to mitigate against multiculturalism, and the reason I targeted this as a discontinuity is not because racism and this kind of thinking isn't a continuity in Australian history. It certainly is, but because the reaction against it proved that, in fact, these views, these old views that Pauline Hanson was espousing, the kind of racist white Australia views, were seen to be a minority view. And so this, in a sense, is a discontinuity. They haven't disappeared and you can't become complacent about them, but it does mean we can see that they've been put into a kind of a minority position on the far right. And many people reacted against this, and the strong reaction against One Nation is something that I'll talk a little bit about later on as well. The other discontinuity is the rise of China as a great power, and China doing what many great powers do, what all great powers do, simply bully other smaller nations. So bully them in the sense that simply they can do, for the reason that they can do it. America did that for many years. Britain did that beforehand. China is now acting as a great power. In its claims on the South China Sea being just one extreme example of the kinds of claims a great power feels it can make. And this is certainly one of the discontinuities within the medium term that Australia has to deal with. I mentioned scale again. Again, I'll just emphasise that in terms of trade, Australia's trade with China increased some 400% in this period, whereas China's trade with Australia didn't increase at all in terms of proportion. China's economy grew, of course, but the proportion of trade with Australia remained much the same. So again, this is an example of a discontinuity within the history. And finally, we have racism and the ghosts of white Australia. Now, the obvious thing is the continuing racism that exists in Australia, but more importantly, in terms of discontinuity, we have these strong reactions against that. In fact, it's highlighted. It's not tolerated as it had been once in the past, or accepted as simply a matter of course. The other thing is racism is often seen simply that kind of direct hostility that people have. But racism takes all kinds of forms, and the citizenship test, the attempt to kind of impose a certain kind of conformity on people, is another more subtle kind of racism, which is perhaps not a discontinuity, it's perhaps a continuity, but something that I think is worth pointing out. It begins to grow towards the end of this period. Finally, we have some new elements. One of the most interesting ones is the development of Asian identity. There are many institutions now in Australia that call themselves Asian Australian of various kinds. And this is interesting because it's taking things away, broadening things away from simply identifying as a particular language group such as Chinese or Vietnamese, and broadening things out and using Asian in a kind of as a generalist term, in the same way that European is sometimes used in Australia, to show a kind of general heritage and uniformity. This hasn't necessarily developed too much, but it is, I think, something that's going to develop even more. I just want to point this out as a kind of something to look out for in the development. Daigo, this is something that grew up, and again, it points back to the sense of scale. The milk powder, people remember the shortages of milk powder on Australian shelves. This was caused by simply a small number of people, let's say as a percentage of the Chinese population, a small number of people in China deciding they wanted Australian milk powder for reasons to do with their lack of trust in the product in China, and using students and others and individual shoppers in Australia to source that. So again, a very informal way, although some of these Daigao have now developed, of course, into multi-million-dollar companies. But in the beginning, they were simply students and others earning a bit of extra money by buying things off the shelves and mailing them back directly to China. So I put this as a new thing. In some ways, it's not. It harkens back to the informal relationships whereby people sent their remittances back from as early as the gold rush period. How did you get your gold back to your family, your village? You used friends to take it back. And then later on, they developed into more formal relationships through stores and postal services. And so a similar kind of thing. So in some ways new, but in other ways, perhaps not so new. Tourism. There had, of course, been some tourists from China at different times, but they were very rare, just a few individuals. Certainly a new element in this period is the large numbers of Chinese students, Chinese tourists that have affected Australia in many ways, such as the way the city of Sydney highlights its Chinese New Year, or now Lunar New Year, and literally paints, or not literally, but certainly covers the Opera House red. Again, this is an example of a small number, as far as China is concerned, of people and of tourists, Chinese tourists all over the world. It's a relatively small percentage end up in Australia, and this has a tremendous impact. And politics. Now here I'm talking about people of Chinese heritage directly entering into Australian politics. You can go back to as far as people like Harry Chan from an old Chinese Australian Darwin family, who was a mayor of Darwin very early on, but he was a kind of a one-off. There were only a few examples like that. But then you had someone like Peter Wong, who appeared in the Unity Party at the time of the reaction against Pauline Hanson. And then subsequent to that, you've got people such as Penny Wong, Gladys Liu, born outside of Australia, although largely grown up in Australia, such as Penny Wong, who are entering mainstream Australian politics. Or more recent examples, someone like Pierre Shuai-Yang, who was from mainland China, grew up in mainland China, and now entered Australian politics as well. Many people would argue the proportion is still not enough, in terms of Australian politics. Asian representation still could be, or non-white representation should be more, but nevertheless, it is happening, and it's happening on an increasing level. Art. The impact of Chinese Australian artists in Australia is quite large. You've got someone like Guan Wei, who's actually painted about that himself, talks about his own progression from being a Chinese artist to a Chinese Australian artist to being an Australian artist, perhaps exaggerating how he himself has changed in terms of looks, but certainly in terms of his art and perception of his art. And this is happening on a larger scale. And not just with famous artists such as Guan Wei, but also individual artists who are bringing their skills and, using it to kind of paint and to see Australia in different ways. And I mentioned Chinese opera because I mentioned it before in the past. It's always existed, and it continues to be performed in Australia, but it continues to be performed mainly within the Chinese community with a few interested people from outside the community. There's no sign that Chinese opera is going to have an impact on broader Australian culture just yet, but you never know. But certainly art is having much greater impact. And finally, we have the idea of soft power. Now, soft power represents the direct attempt on part of the Chinese government on a formal way to influence and to have an impact on people. In the beginning of this period, that was seen as quite benign. Confucius Institutes were established without any problem. But over a period of time, people have become more and more wary of these kinds of formal relationships and have even accused the Confucius Institutes of being some kind of insidious spy agencies. I think the evidence of that is extremely thin in terms of the Confucius Institutes, but nevertheless, it shows how people's perceptions have changed and how they re-evaluate things on evidence or lack of evidence, depending on their makeup. So then we come, of course, to our final period, the last 5 years. I won't go over this in any detail, but I just want to ask the question, is this what's happening in the last 5 years in terms of deteriorations of relationships and treatment of Chinese Australians an unexpected turn of events, or is it an inevitable progression from previous history? And I'd argue that there are some discontinuities that have come home to roost that are worth looking at, just in terms of trying to understand what's happening. So racism, the most extreme example of racism, of course, is this blind kind of equating of anyone with Chinese heritage with having a pro-Beijing attitudes. And this pops up in such works as Clive Hamilton's Silent Invasion, or in the demands of Senator Betts that people of Chinese heritage should somehow be told, asked to denounce Beijing and the Communist Party. That's kind of extreme racism exists, unfortunately. It's not the only evidence we have. There are, of course, many other attitudes, but certainly it's an element that's popping up whenever fear shows itself. And we have, of course, greed and fear. Greed being Australia's desire to get as much money out of China as possible, and now the fear that relationship, that economic power, is being used against them. One example being, of course, the Australian wine industry, now under much heavier tariffs as a result of Chinese government decision-making. And finally, we have the great power, that is to say, China as a great power and exercising its rights as a great power. So Australia then finds itself, it thought it was dealing with a panda, it now finds itself dealing with something much larger, and some would argue that means Australia is now having to make a choice between China and the United States. And then we have to ask ourselves the question, well, is this based on ignorance of history, ignorance of the realities? Is it based on misinterpretation? Or is it, as some would argue, there's no smoke without fire? And I'm not going to answer any of those questions, but again, I just want to say that looking at the history, looking at what's the continuity and discontinuities can help us perhaps answer some of these questions. Now here, I want to talk about how perspectives of Chinese Australian history, and particularly the changes and factors influencing those perspectives, are affected by contemporary events. And this, of course, has been the theme of this series of lectures, this idea of a reflective history. So people might remember the so-called history wars. These took place in the 1990s, and there are arguments about Australia's relationship with its history and with particularly its British history and British heritage, with people on one side, such as Keating, arguing for more independence in Australia as an independent nation and needing to kind of see the bad things in that British heritage as well. Others on more conservative sides, such as Howard, glorifying and wishing to kind of highlight that heritage. And this was fought out with various historians also. So the idea of using politics and identity to kind of, and history as a weapon, as a tool to push your particular views is, of course, not unusual. And it's happening also with Chinese Australian history. And so the question is, and what and how we think is reflected in what and how we think about our history. And I'll just give two examples of that. One is a former example, an old example that I've mentioned in the previous lectures. White Australia, during the period of White Australia, right through from the beginning of the 20th century through to nominally to at least the 1970s and 80s, White Australia whitewashed the history of Australia by either eliminating or confining to stereotypical roles or non-white elements of Australian history, particularly Chinese elements. And I've emphasised that where that's happened in previous lectures. So this is an example of how politics or thinking, ideology, psychology has influenced the history. It wasn't some conspiracy on the part of historians to do things. They just were thinking in a particular way, and it just made it very difficult for them to even see what was there. The evidence was always there, and we can find it now. Now, the current example is, in theory, the opposite of that. We now, with the greater perceptions of China and Chinese people and Chinese culture, and for various reasons, people are uncovering and highlighting the Chinese in Chinese Australian history, or Chinese in Australian history and Chinese Australian history. Now, I've seen that happen over the last 20 or more years that I've been a historian of Chinese Australian history. Much changes, differences in taking it seriously as an element of Australian history. Now, I wish I could say that this was a case of the bad history of the past being happily replaced by a good history of the present. But unfortunately, I won't say that. In fact, I'd say it's all bad history. And by that, I mean that it's bad history if it seeks to establish a worldview first and then only drag in history kicking and screaming along, preferably as a biased witness to back you up. And all people of all agendas are guilty of this, mostly unconsciously, attempting to use history. Of course, to coin a phrase, everybody wants history on their side, but not everybody wants to be on the side of history. So what I'm talking about today is what I can characterise as unwhitewashing of history. And this is not so much a stripping away of the whitewash of the past to reveal the reality, nominal objective reality. It's more a splashing on lots of yellow to balance out the white, to take the metaphor a little bit further. And of course, as you'd expect, it's all a bit of a mess. And so what I'm going to talk about here is just 4 what I call reflectives. That is to say, 4 perspectives, 4 agendas, 4 attitudes that are contributing to this current Chinese-Australian historical discourse. And I'm not going to say that any of these are wrong or any of these are right. I'm simply going to say these are different perspectives, and it's best to be aware of them as you look at what kinds of history is being written or what elements of the history are being picked out. So I call them the consular, the migrant, the ABCs, and white guilt. Now, the consular is based on this concept of, or this idea of the 100 years of humiliation. And that's, for those of you who don't know, is roughly the period from the 1840s to the 1940s, under which China was subjected to a great deal of humiliation and political interference and economic interference by mainly European colonial powers, beginning with the Opium Wars and going right through. And as a view of history, it's perfectly reasonable. Certainly, there's no reason for the Chinese historians not to discuss the history in that way, and any view of history would find this quite reasonable. What also happens, the other side of that coin, is that the Chinese Communist Party will argue that because of this 100 years of humiliation, this justifies their rule and means that they are the only ones that can protect China from a similar period of humiliation. That's, of course, a political view that goes well beyond the history, and I won't discuss that. But the interesting thing about it is that people brought up with this view of history, particularly it tends to be a bit black and white in some terms, means that they will pick out only certain elements of the history. Now, I call it the consular view because you can get the Chinese consul to come along and help pay for certain memorials in Australia if you're going to doing one that particularly highlights an element of racism, such as, say, Lemming Flat. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. Lemming Flat certainly should be memorialised, certainly should be known as part of the history. Certainly the racism that has been there was anti-Chinese, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. But it can be a bit black and white, can be a bit unnuanced. And for example, the memorials will be put up in Mandarin without thinking about how the history, the people of that Lemming Flat area were, of course, not Mandarin speakers. They were Cantonese or other dialect speakers. Again, a small element, but if you're looking at history from the point of view of the people who actually lived that history, it's an important element. And this kind of view, this kind of more black and white view of history tends to mitigate against that. So it's just a perspective that needs to be, people should be aware of when kind of looking at the different historical accounts. Now there's the migrant view. Now the migrant view is very standard. It's very common for any migrant to Australia, any migrant group to Australia, to look for historical predecessors, to be able to identify with people from their own culture, their own historical background, their own country. They were already in Australia generations before, so they can identify and say, well, I am Australian. I can identify with Australia more strongly because of my ancestors. And so Chinese Australians, of course, do the same thing. The tendency of this, and again, Chinese Australians, Chinese migrants are not any different from anyone else, is to focus on a kind of a victim's progression. The idea being that the ancestors in the past had a really hard time, but we're doing much better. So the idea of this kind of migrant progression. So it's kind of written into the history. And again, it can be a little unnuanced, but it's perfectly reasonable. And there's certainly nothing wrong with people attempting to do that or seeking to do that. Although, I'd say some people would then claim that Zheng He must have discovered Australia sometime long before Captain Cook, and that's their way of seizing Chinese identity into Australia. So I would argue that's taking it a bit too far, but again, you can see where people are sometimes coming from. The ABCs. This is a group that particularly wants, or is looking for, in one extreme anyway, looking for an apology for the racist actions of the past. Chinese New Zealanders, Chinese Canadians, both have got apologies from their governments and handsome buckets of money that they were able to use to do research. And I would certainly not say no to any such bucket of money if it came along. But again, it tends to be people who are Australian born, or if not Australian born, at least have been in Australia for a long period of time, from probably the 50s and 60s, when, of course, the White Australia policy was still going strong. They naturally feel that they were hardly done by, and so, as were their ancestors, and quite reasonably think that maybe an apology is due. Again, it's a perfectly reasonable viewpoint, but it tends to lead to using history for political purposes, and again, emphasising certain elements and not looking at other elements, because this, of course, would mitigate against their case. And finally, we have the white guilt view of history. Now, white guilt is a perfectly good thing in the sense that people should, of course, acknowledge crimes of the past. It's particularly important in terms of Australian Indigenous history to acknowledge and try to make amends for some of the bad things that happened in the past. One of the problems that comes about with it is that sometimes it's used as simply to keep white people at the centre of attention. So it tends to mitigate against giving people agency. So it tends to imagine that Chinese people, for example, couldn't have done anything or were prevented from doing it. They wanted simply because the white people were in control all the time. They made the laws, they did this, they were racist. They're the centre of attention. If you look at the history at all that I've gone through in the last few lectures, you see that that's certainly not the case. So there's plenty of white guilt to go around, as long as it doesn't kind of continue to make people victims against a white dominance, whether that's negative or positive. Now, all of this is not, they're not necessarily contradictory, these various perspectives. They can kind of reinforce themselves sometimes, but I think people should be aware of what they are and how modern issues are reflecting on how we write and look at the history. So, given this confusion about history and its perspectives, the question is, does history help at all? And I'll just ask a few questions to help you think about this possible answer to this question. For example, as I mentioned in the last lecture, does knowing Asia were superficial and biased in the 1950s and 60s help us understand Asia today? The advantage of historians is we can look at the files of Asia in the 50s and 60s and make a judgment about what evidence they had and why they did certain things. Asia, of course, in modern times doesn't open those files up and just simply says you've got to take their word for it when they do things. So again, we can use history to maybe not assume that Asia today is exactly the same as Asia of the past, but to ask ourselves, is the thinking, is the psychology similar, and is that likely to cause similar results? I think history can help there to some degree. The other question, a broader question, perhaps a little confusing, but is, does knowing that people who held views we condemn today thought that they were doing the right thing help us understand those, us, who also think that we are doing the right thing now? And here I'm just arguing for a sense of a nuance, not just in looking at the past and trying to understand why people did the things they did, but also looking at things today and not condemning everybody to being racist or nationalist or whatever they happen to be if you don't agree with their thinking. There's usually more to it, to that, and history, I think, can help us understand that. Or, finally, do we, like children, need to make our own mistakes and reinvent the wheel while the adults look on in despair? History may well be a useful tool. It doesn't mean we can do anything about it, perhaps, and that's a more a pessimistic view of the value of history. So what has this overview of history exposed, the overview that we've been giving the last 6 lectures or so? Certainly, I've emphasised the idea of the whitewashing that's taken place and the fact the need for more nuance in the history. And these are nuances, certainly something that historians always argue for, just as they also say there's more to the history than is usually taught. We know that people mostly get their history from high school and a few other random movies and whatever, and the depth is usually not very great. And certainly we can see that there's a shallow foundation for many of the myths that exist about Chinese Australian history. And I've just pointed out some of the agendas behind perhaps some of the new myths that are beginning to be generated even today. Myths are always being generated along with the history. One thing I'd like to focus on is this gap in our knowledge. There's a huge gap in our knowledge of the 1950s to the 1980s. This is the period of the White Australia policy survivors generation. And it's a big research gap that I think we need to fulfill. Before that, we have a surprising amount of research done in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. In the post-1980s period, we have a lot of research that isn't historical, but it will be a source for historians in the future. So I have less concern about that period. But this period of the 1950s to 80s has got relatively little sources. People are still alive, and so we really should be doing major oral history work if we're going to kind of preserve what was going on. And as I pointed out, many of the things we think of as new actually had their origins in this period. And finally, the other thing I think I'd like to emphasise that we can learn from this history is the psychological. And this is akin to the White Australia psychology. So I pointed out before that the White Australia psychology didn't allow people to look at the history and to really see Chinese Australians as anything more than fodder for racism or gold miners, and pretty much everything else got whitewashed out of the history. And that was mainly a psychological attitude that prevented the history from being researched properly. And I'd say that today we still have another psychology, and this is an addiction to the victim stereotype. The idea that of China and racism, Chinese people and racism as lacking people lacking agency. I think this is very important that we see from this history that people had a great deal of agency. They did what they wanted to do. Sure, they had barriers, they had problems, and these need to be talked about. But they had aims and they had means of achieving those aims. And I would say that these four reflectives that I talked about and others share this psychology to a great degree. And unless we can get around that and begin to see the history from the point of view of the people who lived that history, we won't be able to see the history in all its nuance. So, what of the future? So here we brought the history up to the present, to the very edge of the present. So it's a temptation to look at the future. I'm not going to. The obvious one is to look at all the sound and fury of politics and economics. And I know many people are mostly interested in what's happening today. And I'm not going to really talk about that aspect because I think many can do that better than I. In fact, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit more, is just simply the interesting rise of in the last generation of art. And I've already mentioned this before, and I'll just repeat it again a little bit here. By art, I don't mean just simply the painters. I mean, you've got a whole network of people cherishing art galleries themselves, such as the White Rabbit Gallery. And it's not only China-born artists, people from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and other parts of the diaspora, as well as Australian-born people of Chinese heritage, are all involved in this mix. And it's not just repeating of things from China. It's like as artists do, they're taking on what they're learning in Australia, what they're living in Australia, and interpreting that through their own lens. And I think this is having a great contribution to the culture, which in the long term would cut through the shadows of the fear and greed thrown out by politics and economics. And I'd argue that this is a more organic element that hints at some long-term influences on a more fundamental level. And speaking of the long term, I now want to finish up by just talking about history in terms of perspectives of the long, medium, and short term. All right, just to give us another perspective on how we look at Chinese Australian history. So the long term, if you look at the long term, we can see the European invasion of Australia coincides with a relatively brief period of Chinese decline, brief in terms of the overall length of Chinese history and culture, going back 2,500 years or more. And this is ending now, it seems to be ending now, and it's restoring China to its usual place as dominant within its region. What's different, of course, is for the first time that region is in fact the whole globe and very much includes an entity called Australia that wasn't previously within Chinese history. So this is the long-term view which we can view the history. Medium term is more Australia in its post-European history. And in that period, that only 200 years or so, Australia has always existed within the sphere of only two empires. And the second of that empire seems to be declining now. So then the question is, looking at it from that perspective, will Australia drift into the sphere of a third empire, or will it continue as some kind of independent middle power, in which case striking out in a new era of history that we haven't previously experienced. Then we have the short term. Now, the short term is, of course, the level that most of us live on within our own lifetimes. It includes family, business, class, tourism, education, etc. And these are various factors that, of course, pull people in different directions. They're not all going in one direction. And this particularly circles around the idea of identity. These issues both enhance and diminish people's sense of Chineseness. And if you're going to have a Chinese-Australian history, then people have to be identifying as Chinese in some way, no matter how broad and how clumsy that term might be. And so I would argue then that Chinese-Australian history will continue to be an element of Australian history, but needs further recognition within the broader view of Australian history. It serves to identify those who identify as Chinese, so for their purposes, that will always be an important aspect of the history. But I think it also assists in continuing the redefinition of the Australian part of that history, particularly as the white fades and as the nation continues to seek a new identity or some kind of identity that isn't so rooted in simply being white. Certainly Chinese, Australian and other community histories will have to play a very important role in that. So as usual, I've got a range of selected readings for you to look at it to help you with this. Just a few that I can fit on a page. I particularly recommend Monica Tan's Stranger Country as a really interesting attempt on the part of a young Chinese Australian to deal with her being Australian and including colonial past and Indigenous history and relationships with Indigenous Australians. It's quite interesting, quite readable. But any of these books on the list here are also well worth looking at. So finally, I just want to conclude by saying Chinese Australian history, which of course is the title of this series, is a double term designed both to connect and to separate. And as the term Chinese fractures, remembering that it can mean many things to different people, Australian born, not China born, born in Malaysia, born in Taiwan, speaking different dialects, there's a range of things it can mean. As it fractures, the term Australian itself will expand until the need for Chinese Australia as a term becomes as restricted as Irish Australian or British Australian is now. Now, this is, of course, an of course moment that is yet to come. It's something in the future. And I think the movement towards that kind of expansion is held back by many factors. The continual migrant classification, the idea that Chinese Australian history is a migrant history, despite the fact that, of course, Chinese history goes back 200 years to the beginnings of the European Australia. So if it's migrant, it's migrant as British or Irish Australian history. The lack of agency, as I mentioned before, there's this inability to see people of Chinese origin having their own aims and objectives. Of course, the continual dominance of the white mainstream in many aspects of Australian culture. The fear of China, another outside influence in many ways, that's dominating more than it objectively needs to be. Identity, of course, always an important aspect. The whitewashing that I mentioned before, and also an element of self-orientalizing. And people are going to identify as Chinese. Many people will want to do that to a greater degree and perhaps emphasize some of the elements more than the history will bear. So all of these elements go into the mix that is Chinese Australian history. So I just want to thank you now for listening. Hopefully you listen to the whole of the lecture series. It's all in one piece. Makes up 6 or 7 lectures. And I just want to thank the Australia-China Institute of Arts and Culture and Jin Han for supporting and sponsoring this series, and also a special word of thanks to Lindsay Liu, who we just heard has gone off to have her baby today, and we wish her all the best with that. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for this very interesting last lecture. I suppose it's very interesting. It's also particularly, closer to us and more relevant in terms of a time. I came in 1988, so all the things you talked about, I felt so familiar and so enlightening and informative, looking at from new perspective or historical perspective. It's really interesting. Often you go through things, you don't look back from that lens. So looking back from that lens, it's really interesting. Before I take on the questions, I take the the liberty of asking my first question. It's in general terms, in a way, because I have been very much influenced by T.S. Eliot quite a lot, because that's my specialty in modernism. T.S. Eliot is particularly talking about relationship between present and past. You know, no past exists without influence of a present. So all the past, you look at the past always from the present tense. So I really would like to ask, being a historian yourself and studying Chinese Australian history for so many years, do you see the changes, or do you think that the history of Chinese Australian constantly changes through the present lens?
Yeah. Oh well, yes. I think that's what I was trying to convey with my idea of a reflective history. The idea being that yes, we're constantly reflecting back. The history is reflecting to us, and we're looking back on the history and rewriting it and re-looking at it. I think it's very interesting. I've seen that particularly in the last 20 years or so. When I first started doing Chinese Australian history, there was only a couple of us that were doing it. Up till then, people looked at Chinese Australian history only in terms of its effect on white Australia or on racism and so forth, and never looked at Chinese Australians in their own terms. So that was one change. But since then, there's been a great many other changes. And of course, we're getting some of them I would consider to be not as positive as others. You know, we've got this look at trying to see everything through the terms of the relationship with China. And of course, that's fair enough. I mean, the relationship with China is always an important aspect of that, but it's not the only aspect. And so we need, but as long as we're aware of it, I mean, with these perspectives, you can't say one is bad or one is good or one is more correct. It's more about just being aware of what they are and then using that awareness to make your own decisions of where people are coming from. Mm-hmm. And certainly, I certainly agree with T.S. Eliot and his view of history.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, as we gather more education, more knowledge, that also obviously change the perspective that we have, towards the past. The other question is about the Chinese Australian community, or people often refer, to a group of people coming from wherever, China, mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and, Singapore and everywhere else. If they have Chinese heritage, and then it is referred to as a Chinese Australian community, which I found is really existing virtually. I never feel like I belong to a Australian Chinese community, because there is no such a thing as it is, because we are all so very individual. And you mentioned that it will be some time before Chinese Australian becomes like, British Australian. So it's quite broad terms. It doesn't really, because the Chinese Australian, because each Chinese is very different from the next. It depends on when he comes and where he comes, how much he carries. So what's your opinion or feedback from other people that you talk to about this sense of Chinese community?
Well, it's something that
it's 5 o'clock.
It's got a double-sided elements there. So what you were talking about is the obvious one of people as individuals coming from different backgrounds, different cultures, different dialects and so forth. This is how they identify themselves, and they arrive in a place like Australia or grow up in a place like Australia. And then, all things being equal, people should then, of course, be able to develop their own sense of identity. But of course, we all know that we also have our senses of identity imposed upon us in some way. So we're also looking at the outsiders. And so you can have a bunch of people as diverse as you like, but if people are always pointing their finger at them and saying, "Oh, you're Chinese Australian, you're the Chinese Australian community," after a while you either get really annoyed about this if you're so inclined, or you simply accept that you are part of this amorphous community, which you may not know where it is exactly, but somebody seems to know. And again, this is where part of the white Australia racism comes in, part of the dominance of China comes in, because everybody knows about China. Everybody's just assumed to be Chinese in that kind of China nationalist sense. Of course, that's very offensive to some people from Taiwan or Malaysia or various other places who kind of maybe have never even been to China. So you've got this other element going on here, and people can accept it or reject it or have to deal with it. So that's the other side of that coin. And so I mean, I've sat at tables, and I'm sure you've done the same, Jim, where I've sat at tables, those round tables in Chinese restaurants where everybody's there has been nominally Chinese in some sense, but some speak English, some don't speak any Chinese language, some speak only Cantonese, some speak Mandarin, some are Australian born, and of course they're all very diverse. But for other purposes, they do accept that they're Chinese, but mostly in relationship to the non-Chinese, so you've got this other thing going on there. And that's an important aspect of the history and the perspectives that we have to kind of, unfortunately, keep factoring in. And it works. It's not just in Australia. Gregor Benton, writing on Chinese in Europe, has said some very interesting things about this very thing, why the Chinese in Europe are treated differently, they're perceived differently as a diaspora. Even that term diaspora is part of that imposition of an identity on what in Europe you can imagine is a very diverse range of people that ranges from Vietnamese, Chinese people that speak French to people from northern China to people from Fujian. I mean, a whole variety of people doing different things in different parts of Europe. So, the same thing is happening in Australia and other parts of the world as well, of course.
Mm-hmm. That's a very, very interesting answer. And in relation to this, and I think I'll go for the next question, which is really touch on this from Eileen. My oldest Australian-born Chinese relatives call themselves Australians when they are abroad. So are my children. And when they use the term at home, they basically are referring to white Australians. Did Irish or Lebanese or other Australians go through this identity challenge? And would non-whites ever really be able to identify as a simply Australian?
Yes, I mean, the older generation, certainly I can remember many years ago when I was first interviewing an older Chinese Australian, and he sat there and referred to me as an Australian. And this was a man who had been born in Australia. His mother was, his grandmother was British. He'd gone to a school around the corner from where I'd gone to school. He spoke with a broad Australian accent, but he still quite unreflectively just referred to me as Australian and not himself. And this is something that I think, yes, all groups have gone through it, but it seems to have persisted much longer with Chinese Australians. I must say, Chinese Australians have been, they're multi-generation people. But that's why I was particularly focusing on that white Australia survivors generation, the 50s and 60s, because that's a generation that kind of still felt that very strong sense that they were not Australian, although they could use the term Australian only to reflect to white people. But I think in the younger generation, as far as I'm aware, my daughter's generation and that generation of younger people, they seem to much more unreflectively refer themselves as Australians. I don't think they've got that dichotomy as much. I mean, it depends on individual circumstances, of course, but I think it is fading, but it's taken longer than it has with other groups. Irish Australians, I don't know. The Irish were funny. They were quite happy to call themselves Irish because they didn't want to be English. But I think the Irish, if anything, were the first to start calling themselves Australians more than anything else. But again, to distinguish themselves from the English. But that's another peculiarity of Irish history lying back in the 19th century. So, of course, it varies from group to group. You can't make a generalisation. But in general, I would say, a lot of it has to do with the remnants of the white Australia in the 50s and 60s. And this perception of Chinese Australians seems to be more intense than it is with other groups. Perhaps because the other groups are smaller or simply because China is a superpower. One of the things I was going to use in this lecture was the question, I didn't do it in the end, was what if Greece was a superpower? If Greece was a large superpower able to impose itself on Australia, would we treat Greek Australians differently? Again, there's no easy answer to that. Perhaps we would, perhaps we wouldn't. But you can't get away from the fact that China exists as a huge global superpower, and this is always going to be one part of the equation.
Mm-hmm. That's a great analogy. If a Greece were a superpower, what would happen? So yeah, that's really good and very interesting. The question from Udis. Thanks, Udis, for coming, attending this. Interesting, you say big gaps in understanding 1950s and 1980s. This was the Cold War period. Was it often hard to see China through the fog of the Cold War?
Yes, that was certainly another aspect of it. So you had a double imposition on the Chinese community. You had the sense of them the usual racist white Australia kind of sense. And then you also had this Cold War overlap where Chinese were being accused of being somehow linked to communist China. And that was, of course, a no-go. And so that was a period where people kind of tried to keep a low profile, certainly didn't get involved in politics, just did business, just educated their children, preferred their children to get educated in the professions, such as doctors, engineers, and so forth, safe professions. So certainly the Cold War element was a major impact, a major factor within that period as well. And people's attitudes. There's also other things. There was still an element of smuggling going on, refugees. The refugee crisis in Hong Kong in the 50s was never recognised by the Australian government, despite pleas from the British government. And so people were trying to come to Australia, people with connections to Australia they had to come through devious means within the White Australia policy or even after, as waiters, as refugees, as students, sponsorship. So it was a kind of a tight-knit network that was going on there. Fascinating history and one that we don't know enough about, but one that always tried to keep a low profile. And then that's part of the reason why we don't know as much about it. Nobody thought to study it at that time, and many people continue to be a bit quiet about it, even today. When you ask older people, you've really got to dig a bit to kind of get a bit more information out of people of that generation.
One person said, thank you for the great series. And the other person asked, we will share this recording of this series. Yes, we will definitely do our best because today is our last day and tomorrow is a mandated leave. The university will shut down. So we'll try to push that onto our website. So look out on our website of the recording of this session. We may or may not be able to do the editing, but we will definitely put out today's session as it is, at least. The other person asking question, what do you think what do you think about the new Museum of Chinese Australian Mocha?
Well, in theory, a museum is great. Certainly there should be a museum in Sydney. The trouble is that, as I've said, there's always perspectives about history. And Mocha is perhaps a bit confused at this point whether it wants to be a museum of history or whether it wants to be a cultural centre. And there's always this argument about, are you just going to showcase things Chinese or are you going to really focus on Chinese Australian history? It's hard. You're trying to develop something new. A museum's a hard thing to establish. If you're going to put a lot of money into something like that, I'd rather put it into research and into archives. I think we have a lot of work to be done before we really know enough about Chinese Australian history, and we can promote that in other ways. But people like a museum. They like the idea of a building that they can walk into. It kind of presents in a particular way. Certainly I support it in theory, but I like to reserve judgment about where it's going to go because museums can very often get it wrong in various ways because they focus more on objects and visual things and perhaps drift away from a good historical foundation. But with the right historical foundation, there's no reason why the museum can't be a success or can't build on the foundation and develop in the future, of course.
Yeah, I suppose being engaging is quite fundamental. You don't want the museum like no one goes there. So I think there is also element of that as well, I suppose. The next question is Janet. Janet asks, thank you for including the periphery of the activities of the centre. It helps me who lives in Cairns, far north Queensland to feel including. So that's a thank you for you. And Barry, hi, Michael, excellent presentation. My question is, do Australians or white people experience the same type of issues when they go and live in China? Is this normal for any immigrants when migrating to a foreign country?
Well, there's not many white people that migrate to Australia. They're often there as business people or as academics or whatever. So their position is not very comparable. But there is a large number of African migrants in China, southern China, and they're more comparable. And they've gone there as business. They live there. They've intermarried, and they've developed close connections with China. And they have very similar issues in terms of racism and discrimination and so forth, and similar issues of intermarriage and friendship and exception. So, you've got the whole gamut of issues there. So, yeah, I mean, Australia often beats itself up about its racism, and it should. But obviously, all cultures have difficulties with accepting people who look different or who appear to act differently. So a comparable group would be the African Chinese. They seem to be the only significant group of people in modern times anyway migrating into Australia, into China at this point. And I would have to say, yes, in general terms, their treatment is as good or bad or similar to what you in the general situation in Australia, I guess.
Yeah, that's a very interesting analogy and a comparison. Yes, I can see that point. Janet actually continues. It's very interesting. I think many people would echo her point of view. However, I want to say that the present intellectual atmosphere is quite toxic. So toxic that I have ceased watching my current affairs. The constant China bashing has left me blue with bruises. There doesn't seem to be in counterbalancing voices to provide a more objective view of China. I neither support nor don't support the PRC government. I don't suppose history could help the situation. What's your view?
Well, I hope it can. I mean, that's why I was at pains to point out, for example, that my illustration about the sheer scale difference between China and Australia, because I feel that there are many elements of Chinese attitudes and behaviour with Australia which are historical, cultural, or simply a matter of scale, which is to say they're distinct from ideology and government action. And if people were more aware of those kind of factors, you'd begin to kind of pass out what's really the responsibility of Xi Jinping or the Communist Party and what's really simply in the nature of a large power operating in the world. It doesn't necessarily give you a good answer. I mean, you may end up with the same problem, but it does help in the way you deal with it. I mean, Australia's problem is you've got people who are ignorant, but using the China bashing kind of to generate their own ego and to generate fear that helps their own sense of power. So you've got that. That's a very unhelpful way of dealing with it. People who don't have that attitude still have difficulties with these problems and these issues. I mean, obviously, Australia has a lot of problems to deal with, but they don't have to be dealt with on this kind of fear-mongering basis. And I agree, much of the media reporting has been very, very ignorant and hasn't been helpful at all. But the alternative voices are there, but you've got to look for them, and you've got to kind of search them out on the internet and look around and think about things. Stan Grant, I thought, was doing some reasonable stuff in the mainstream media as one example of something in the mainstream that isn't too bad. But you've got to look for other alternative voices as well, I think. But certainly in the history, yes, I would argue that if a thorough knowledge of the history helps you to realise, at least to distinguish between what's kind of current and what's something that's just a continuity in the history and is likely to be there well past the term of office of any particular prime minister or president.
Mm-hmm. I think, it has a lot to do with understanding or knowledge. And as you see, the versus in opposition is ignorance. So many people don't really understand, China, Chinese history or culture, and China is not one face. And there are many various aspects to China. This related question is a Hawke's question. Generally, Chinese Australians view the current breakdown in China-Australian government relations very differently from the general Australian public. How much of that is due to different or lack of understanding of the history of China, or its status as a number one superpower?
Oh, I think quite a good deal. I think by and large, I mean, I've talked to people who are, reasonably intelligent, articulate Australians, but they still seem to have a very Cold War view of China and the Communist Party. They haven't seemed to grasp the idea of the imperatives of capitalism, for example. I mean, many of the things that China is doing is simply what America has done or done in the past as it seeks to protect its economic profits and so forth. There's lots of ways you can look at the history and see how these parallels are there. That doesn't mean you approve what America did or approve what China did. I mean, you can still condemn or agree with either side. I mean, you're kind of left with the same problem. It's just how you trying to understand that problem. Of course, for many people, understanding is not something they want, because they want to be able to condemn things straight away. They just want to be able to say, Beijing is bad, Canberra's right, or just as there are many people in China obviously doing the same thing, saying, oh, Canberra's completely wrong, Beijing's 100% right. They're not really interested in any kind of nuanced view, whether it's historical or cultural, because it just makes it easy for them to rally the troops. I mean, this is what it's all about for many people. How do you get people to agree with your point of view? Well, you just make sure the other guy is blamed as being bad. It's very simple stuff. And we haven't got away from that to any large degree. Historians and other intellectuals, of course, are always shouting from the sidelines when it comes to this kind of circling the wagons type mentality that Australia and China have got itself into at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. I'm sure history tells us a lot, because if you look at the history, as you say, reflectively, I mean, when the PRC was established in 1960s and 70s and 50s, it's very different from what China is today, or, from 80s and 90s and, 2020. So it's very different. If you think that China is a typical communist country, you should look at North Korea. So it's very different, Next, a question from Neville, and which very interesting question. My review of last census ancestry data in Darwin and Northern Territory views distortions. For example, Malaysian Chinese identified as Malayu, not Chinese, similarly Timor. Also, third and fourth generation Northern Territory residents said Australia, not Chinese. Is this an important issue for population analysis in other jurisdictions compared to?
Well, it's a problem. I mean, in terms of migration statistics, yes, the Australian governments have always been bad at they've never asked questions about heritage. They've just said, if you're from Vietnam, you're Vietnamese, if you're from Malaysia, Malaysian. And so you have to dig further into statistics to kind of get rough statistics to figure out what percentage of people from Vietnam was actually Chinese heritage and so forth. But having done that, from the purposes of point of view of research, we can't impose an identity on people. I mean, we might well have somebody from Vietnam who nominally is of Chinese heritage, but they may well identify themselves as Vietnamese and be happy with that. I mean, people have got their own identity. Someone of third or fourth generation Chinese Australian heritage who just puts down Australian on the census form, that's their right. I mean, they don't have to identify their heritage. I mean, I have mixed heritage, Welsh, English, Irish, but I'm not going to tick every single box. I mean, I'm not interested in ticking every single box. If those boxes were available on the census form, I'd probably just tick Australian, because, what's the purpose of these kinds of things? You don't have to keep identifying just because of some DNA analysis. Some people like that and want to do it that way. So it's a mix, and you're never going to get quite away from it. Some of these, you can dig out the statistics a bit better. These immigration statistics aren't very helpful. You've got to go beyond that. But the reason I can come up with, say, a percentage of 60% Vietnamese migration in the 80s was Chinese heritage is because that's what the Indo-Chinese Association or other community groups have come up with. People have chosen to identify themselves as Indo-Chinese Chinese at that point. That was from the 70s. That was from the 80s and 90s. What they're doing now, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, what percentage of people, different generation, Australian-born generation, are they continuing to identify themselves as Indo-Chinese Chinese, or do they identify themselves as merely Chinese Australians, or do they identify themselves as Vietnamese Australians, or do they identify themselves as simply Australians? Everybody's got these choices, and presumably even within the one family, you're going to have people making their own choices, and we have to respect those choices. We can't impose them for the purposes of historical analysis or sociological analysis or whatever, as much as academics might like to do that. You've got to respect how people identify themselves, taking into account that, of course, as I said before, identity is also imposed on the outside inevitably by governments and funding bodies and others. I mean, if you're going to get money for setting up a community group, well, then suddenly you've got a bunch of people that are happy to identify as that community group if it means a bit of money. Is that a real or not? It really just depends on what you do with the money, I suppose, or how genuine that is. I mean, that's just one small example of how things get grouped and re-identified according to government policies or historical analysis, or however you want to look at it.
Next, a question, anonymous question asking about the historians. Many Chinese Australian historians are of Anglo background, yourself included. So this is not the case in America, where most scholars are of Asian American background. don't you think it is a time to pass the mantle on to the Chinese Australian communities itself? Shouldn't the Chinese Australian history be written by Chinese Australian, not Anglo-Australians?
Well, the real answer to that is no. It's silly. It's silly in the sense that a historian is a historian. On the other hand, the answer is yes. Of course, people of Chinese Australian background are beginning to write the histories. There's many good PhD students and younger scholars coming up, so the people can be rest assured that there are people with more of various heritage backgrounds. But I reject the idea that someone of Chinese heritage will be a better historian merely because of that. They'll have different perspectives, as I've did before. So obviously, an historian of an Anglo background, such as myself, has different perspectives. And you've got to factor that into when you read them, or the questions I ask will be different from someone else's. But it's a very dangerous thing to think that the Chinese community can write its own history. Communities always write bad history because, as I said, they have an agenda, they have a perspective, and they write a particular kind of history that tends to want to emphasize a certain thing. You want historians. And what we really need is historians with more Chinese language skills. And we do have that. Again, that's happening more. There is a new generation of people that do have some good Chinese language skills, and that means that they can read some of the documents better. They have some understanding of the culture or the heritage, or they have good links with the community. So certainly that's all very important, and it is happening. It happened earlier in the United States for a whole bunch of reasons to do with or the history of Asian American studies and so forth. So that they're kind of a generation or so ahead of us as far as that is concerned. Australia's a bit behind on that level, but things are changing, and certainly I think, yeah, as you say, when it's passing on the baton, that's happening, and I'm certainly more than pleased that is happening.
In related question by Sophie, what do you think about the state of Chinese Australian history in academia?
Well, that's in a bit of a parlous state. There is no Chinese Australian history course taught in any university in Australia. What you have is, of course, you have migration studies, which I think is not a good substitute for Chinese Australian history. You have, of course, Australian history, and they'll try and kind of do a kind of a potted, let's pick a group each seminar and we'll talk about them kind of thing. But it really doesn't cover it. I think there's more than enough interest and enough need for some real courses in Chinese Australian history that should be taught. I mean, you could fudge it a bit and call it Asian Australian history, but I think at this point in time, it's justified to have a Chinese Australian history course as such. I taught a similar course in Beijing, for example. There's plenty of material, very much interest. This course is a sense one such course, but it's not an official course within an academic environment. And I know there are various academics who would like to teach such courses. They're kind of stopped by a variety of forces, a general kind of inertia within Australian history departments, I think, and also a sense of kind of discrimination in this, or reverse discrimination in the sense that, if we had a course on Chinese Australian history, then the Greek Italians or the Greek or Italian Australians, they'd all want their own course. I mean, that's the usual kind of argument to stop any kind of change. I think given the depth of Chinese Australian history, given the current relationships with Australia, given the percentage of people of Chinese Australian heritage in Australia, which is quite a significant one, there's more than enough justification for having such courses. But I haven't seen any universities seriously discussing that, despite a number, I can name half a dozen academics who could quite easily teach such a course in various universities around Australia.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Barry, just to support what you just said about who should be historian, rather whether you are Anglo background or Chinese Australian background. With regards to Chinese Australian history, I believe it has nothing to do with one's background, but all to do with one's knowledge. And I'm third generation Australian Chinese, and you know much more about my heritage than I ever will. So that's a very good compliment. Last question, very interesting question. I'm interested in how the relationship between the two countries got back on track after the Tiananmen Square, as Bob Hawke condemned the Chinese government and allowed so many Chinese to stay in Australia. So, yeah.
Oh, well, it was relatively easy. I mean, the Chinese government then was more flexible in the sense that it kind of bore the brunt of human rights complaints, and even allowed, for example, Australia to have a human rights dialogue in various other countries. And so it accepted a certain measure of dialogue on that basis. And that allowed countries like Australia to re-establish or continue its economic connections with Australia by salving their conscience. And then China just gradually pushed those kind of human rights things to the side until they just disappeared, and the economic connections went on. So China in that instance kind of was flexible in responding to other countries' horror at what happened with the Tiananmen massacre, but on the other hand, it massaged it. And then really those countries then didn't pursue that on any kind of really strong level. They used it, Americans used it a little bit to kind of whack China every now and again when it felt like it, but it wasn't very sincere about it until, more recent times. Now they've suddenly decided to use that again. So the trouble is that countries like Australia and America aren't very consistent with their attitudes towards, say, human rights abuses in any country, and so China is quite right to say that they're hypocritical when they do that. They use it only for their own purposes, so that of course diminishes the effect. And by and large, they just focused on the economic, and that's what happened after '89. More flexibility and more focus on what was considered to be the riches of China as the Chinese economy grew. Mm. So quite different from today. I think the China government is not quite so flexible as it was in the past.
Yes, that's again another way another thing that you can get from history. So actually enlighten the present. Lastly, but not least, I would really like to express our heartfelt appreciation of Professor Michael Williams' great expertise and great effort in delivering this excellent series, the first series in Chinese Australian history at Australia-China Institute for Arts and Culture. And it is a very successful series. So you can all go back to listen from the beginning to the very end. And so it's really our sincere thanks to Michael. Chinese Australian history, as we just discussed today, it is actually quite important one. And given where we are today and the rise of China, so our relationship with China, it's all very important to know the history. So Chinese Australian history is an area that this institute is particularly interested and would like to have more public lectures and seminars on this subject, in 2021. So, and also for you to know, our research fellow, Dr. Nicholas Earn, is an anthropologist, ethnomusicologist, and specializing in the investigation of Chinese music history in Australia. So also there is so much interesting stuff in there too. So for historians, here you are in the audience or anyone that you know of, and Michael has recommended a list. So who would like to join us in giving lectures on Chinese Australian history, please contact me, which I sent to the email address, and to send me your proposal, and I'll be more than happy. We're very happy actually to discuss with you, to meet with you, and we can have a plan for 2021. And lastly, thank you all, especially those who have never failed in attending this series. This is a very popular series, and you have our great appreciation. And lastly, and I wish you all, Michael and everyone else, a Merry Christmas and a great New Year. See you in 2021.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Merry Christmas.